So today we're going to talk about impaired driving in Canada, also known as DUI. You'll sometimes hear, which isn't really the term we use in Canada, but you guys understand what it refers to. In the UK, you'll hear drink driving, and you'd often also hear around here drunk driving. But generally speaking, formally, you would hear impaired driving in Canada, which usually refers to impaired driving under the influence of alcohol, which is far more common, but it also under the criminal code refers to impaired driving impaired by drugs. Now, the reason why this is a topic that is worth talking about is because it's one of the most common crimes that you'll see adults running into. It's a crime that's often committed by people who don't have other criminal histories, who maybe don't have other criminal inclinations. It's kind of like your everyman crime that happens all the time. For adults facing criminal charges in Canada, it's the number one most common offense. Previously, we've seen under the YCJA the kinds of offenses that young persons tend to commit, and it doesn't even show up in that chart at all. But once you start dealing with adults, then you start seeing a lot of impaired driving charges. Now, generational attitudes, that just means kind of like the feeling among groups of people of a certain age, they've shifted over the years. It used to be just generally accepted and very common for people to drive drunk. It used to be just sort of what was done, not necessarily approved of, but not really disapproved of in the same way that a lot of other crimes were. And we'll see that the mandatory minimum sentences for impaired driving in Canada can be quite substantial. And this was necessary because it's not just that people were committing this crime without thinking that it was too bad, it's that judges, when they were sentencing, weren't really being very harsh in their sentences either, because it was probably a crime that a lot of them were committing as well. It's a significant crime. It has a huge impact on the population because every day on Canadian roads, there's an average of 4 deaths in accidents related to impaired driving and further 190 injuries, which can be quite severe as well, which means that it's one of the leading causes of death in Canada, especially among young people. You see here in these graphs don't explicitly identify the dark blue parts of the pie charts as being related to alcohol, but really they are. You'll see if you're in the top left of the screen, if we're talking about people from the age of 1 to 24 years, it is the leading cause of death. About a third of deaths, if you're under 25 years, can be attributed to accidents which are almost entirely related to alcohol. In the top right, you'll see that 23% of deaths for people in the age of 25 to 44 years are related to accidents. But that 23% is actually bigger than the 36% in the top left, because that 23%, we're talking about a number of deaths, 7,500 deaths, that is about 3 times as many as the one on the left. So there's actually more people dying of accidents in the age range of 25 to 44 years. So it's a problem for young people. That's why it's significant for guys like you, but it's also significant for people all the way up until their mid-40s. Even if you look at the number of deaths for 45 to 64 years, that's, again, a pretty huge number, maybe about 6 times the number of deaths for the people who are younger. So that 6% of deaths in that age group is an even larger quantity of deaths than in the top right. In any case, there's a lot of people dying on Canadian roads due to impaired driving. So it's a very important topic, and it's one that the government needed to take measures to address effectively. Now, one of the effects of what we'll look at in terms of the legal framework for impaired driving is that there are a lot of safeguards in place to try and make it so that police can pretty effectively build evidence for a case against somebody who's going to be charged with impaired driving. That means that because of those measures that are in place, there's a pretty high conviction rate. When you get charged with drunk driving, you're probably going to get convicted. There's a conviction rate of 73% for impaired driving, whereas the average generally for criminal charges is actually only about 60%. Despite the fact that you have a pretty high conviction rate for impaired driving, it is actually a crime, a charge that goes to trial more than any other criminal charge, which seems contradictory, right? If more people are getting convicted, if the cards are stacked pretty heavily against you that you're probably going to be nailed for it if you get charged with it, then why are people going to trial? Well, if you think about it, this actually makes sense. The kind of people who get charged with general criminal charges often don't have very extensive resources to build a defense. Typically, people who commit crimes in Canada usually are coming from situations where they're not very well equipped to afford a lawyer who can really devote a lot of time to their case. So you have more resources available for your defense, generally speaking, if you're charged with impaired driving than if you're part of the general criminal population. It's also the case that often, if you're charged with impaired driving, you don't have a criminal record. And getting even one conviction is going to be pretty significant to you. If you have a criminal record that's 3 pages long, then the concern over one particular offense isn't as significant. It'd still be quite important, quite significant, but not to the extent that if you have no criminal record at all and you're being charged with impaired driving, which is often the case that people with impaired driving charges don't have any other offenses, then getting a criminal record would be a big deal for you. So you're ready to throw all the resources you have against the charge. Now, when we're talking about impaired driving, there's actually a whole bunch of different offenses that are related that we're going to talk about. The first one is kind of the most obvious one. You're charged with being impaired by alcohol or drugs while driving a motor vehicle. Now, generally, like I mentioned, most of these cases are impaired by alcohol, but you can also be charged with driving while impaired by drugs. And we're wondering to see, it's only been a couple of years that recreational marijuana use has been legalized in Canada, so we'll wait and see to what extent case law emerges about that, whether that'll increase a lot or whether that's just not as much of a social problem as impaired driving by alcohol. Next up is one that's very, very closely related. Really, this is just a parallel to impaired driving by alcohol. We'll talk about this offense. BAC stands for blood alcohol content. And even if it can't be proved that you're actually impaired, that you're driving badly, if they can establish through a breathalyzer that you have been consuming so much alcohol that your blood alcohol content is over 80 milligrams of alcohol per liter of blood, then that's a crime in itself, even if you're the best driver in the world. And we'll see why this separate crime is so useful to the courts to be able to evaluate. Aside from those, there's lesser known and possibly, hopefully, one of the more useful things for you guys to hear about in this lecture is this crime of having the care and control of a motor vehicle while impaired or over 80. And really, this doesn't have its separate section. It's included in the sections in the code that deal with impairment by alcohol. But it's worth talking about separately, just so you understand exactly how it works. Separate from these, but really having the same penalties, is refusing to provide a sample. So one reflex that people have when they're first hearing about being charged with impaired driving or having a blood alcohol content over 80, they say, well, if I breathe into a breathalyzer and I get a number that's over 80, then maybe it's smarter for me to just not breathe into the breathalyzer. Well, the penalties for refusing to provide a sample, this crime here, are really the same as for being impaired. Now, you'll see that a big part of the penalty for impaired driving is that you are disqualified from driving for a period of time, a minimum of a year for your first offense, and it gets longer after that. So driving while disqualified is a separate offense that's kind of like later on down the line, if you decide, well, I really need to drive, so I'm just going to drive. If they catch you doing that, then you get charged with driving while disqualified. So one thing that we do need to establish is that the impaired driving charges all deal with motor vehicles. If you look in the criminal code, it's only a crime if it's a motor vehicle. So what is a motor vehicle? If you're riding a bike through the streets, drunk, then that is not covered by this section of the criminal code. It could be very dangerous for you and for pedestrians, but it's not dealt with unless your bike is pedal assist or motorized. So if it's some motor to it, then it qualifies as a motor vehicle. But if it's a regular mechanical bike, then it won't. However, if people ask the question, so if you're drunk and biking around the city, then they can't stop you. No, the police often will stop you. If a police car happens to see you zigzagging all around the road late at night, showing signs of impairment, then the police will stop you because they're worried about you. And they'll use, even if they can't use impaired driving as a reason to stop you, they can charge you with causing a disturbance while drunk or being drunk in a public place. Really, the goal is to stop you from hurting yourself. So the power they need to get you off that bike is a criminal power, which means you could potentially face some severe criminal penalties for it, even if it's not for impaired driving per se. Now, the danger to others may be significantly reduced, but the danger to yourself on a bike is dramatically increased compared to a car. Perhaps that's debatable because a car is going at a much higher speed, but you really have no protection at all if you're biking, especially in traffic and very impaired. You could really get yourself significantly harmed in that situation. We already mentioned that drugs count too as a source of impairment. However, there are far fewer cases relating to it, at least at the moment. One reason, again, is that drunk driving has a high level that's dwindling, thankfully, but it had a very high level of social acceptance. Impaired driving by drugs doesn't quite have that same profile. It's still something that can happen. Still, you'll run into people who are unable to evaluate their ability to properly drive a vehicle, but it doesn't quite have the same widespread problem that impaired driving by alcohol has had and still has to a certain extent now. Now, if it does happen that a police officer pulls you over for impaired driving, realizes that under the situation you aren't really impaired by alcohol, but they suspect and they have good reason to believe that you're impaired by drugs, then they can administer a field test to see if you are impaired. And once they've decided you are impaired, so you're not able to control yourself well, but that doesn't relate to alcohol, then they can use, provided they have enough solid observation, they can use those reasonable grounds to demand a blood sample or a urine test in order to, like, they won't get a breathalyzer from you because they wouldn't find anything on your breath that would register on a breathalyzer, but they can still get a blood sample or a urine test under the right circumstances.